Right, thank you for that update, Ernie. Welcome, guys. Good evening. I was crossing the street earlier without an umbrella and considered changing the story to Noah tonight, but decided to stick with Job. Jumping into a study that'll be a few weeks and kind of a hard book, difficult book to talk through. Most of us are incredibly familiar with the first couple chapters and the last chapter, but a lot of times we don't really wrestle with the 39 chapters in between those. Let's just do a quick introduction of Job as far as who wrote it and when. We're not sure who wrote it, and we're not sure when they wrote it. The story itself seems to take place around the time of Abraham, the earliest patriarchs, and scholars would point to a couple of things for that. There's no mention of the nation of Israel or the ceremonial law or anything like that. You see Job himself actually in this first chapter performing the priestly duties for his family. His wealth is measured in heads of livestock, no kinds of currency or anything like that. And so they say there's a lot of signs here that the story itself was probably back in the patriarch's time. There's a lot of people who have wrestled with whether or not Job was a historical figure or this was a parable. Maybe. I'm personally not sure it matters. It's even if it was a parable, I lean a little towards historical figure, but even if it was a parable, I don't know that negates any time that Job is repeated in the rest of Scripture. It would be like us talking about the attitude of the prodigal son. We believe the prodigal son was a parable, but we still talk about that son as if he was a real person and reflects his attitude. So as we look at this, maybe it's a parable, maybe it's not. I'm not sure it matters. The point is the point. We're wrestling with what happens with human suffering and those kinds of topics. So again, I lean historical figure, but it's possible it was a parable, and I'm not sure that it much matters. The overview, we're going to go through this in several steps. Tonight we'll take a look at the situation itself and then Job's lament as he finally breaks his silence and begins to mourn over what has happened to him. And then for a good 30 chapters, maybe not quite that many, he has a discussion with three friends. Imagine you and three friends sitting around trying to figure out why stuff happens. Maybe it's a late night talk, maybe it's a talk over coffee or dinner, but it's a deep discussion with good friends. And then you have a fourth friend show up, a guy by the name of Elihu shows up, and he does more of a monologue and gives his answer to why this is happening and challenges some of the views of the others. And then the fun part happens. Then God himself shows up and has a reply for all of these guys who have been speculating about all of this and trying to figure it all out. And then in the final chapter, chapter 42, we have a conclusion of what happens as a result. And so I'm predicting this is going to take somewhere between 6 and 8 weeks for us to get through. Didn't want to go 40 weeks in Job. Don't think my psyche could handle that. But we do want to move through it, medium pace. But I don't think, especially next week. Next week, I'm going to try to bite off that whole first cycle of the three friends, and so it's going to be about 11 chapters. I'm not sure we can read every word that night, so I encourage you to read it on your own and try to keep up. So somewhere to 6 to 8 weeks we'll be looking at. So essentially, as far as content goes, the book tries to make sense of human suffering. I mean, it's a question, hasn't changed its relevance, has it? We still ask that question. In fact, that's probably the number one opposition I get to somebody not believing in God. How could there be a God because I'm going through blank? It's always very self-focused and say there can't be a God if I've lost my job, if I've lost my spouse, if I've lost my child, those sorts of things. You fill in the blank, and this idea of suffering is one that apparently we've owned for thousands and thousands of years. Why do we go through all this misery is the question. Now, I'm going to give you a little bit of a spoiler alert here, so plug your ears if you don't want to hear the end. You're not going to really have an answer by the end of the book. Even when God shows up, he doesn't necessarily say, okay, here's why I did this. Let me lay this out for you. In fact, what he ends up saying is, you couldn't handle it if I did tell you. It's not yours to know, it's mine to know. And so it really is, in my opinion, Job is an incredibly comforting yet very unsatisfying book. I don't know if you guys agree. I don't know if you agree by the end of this. Many people, as a result, don't really care for this book. They kind of skip it, or like I said, we look at the first 2 chapters and the last one, and we just tell the narrative story of Job, but we don't really wrestle with what it says, mainly because it doesn't give definite answers, and it's kind of hard to determine if what they're saying, especially when we get into I was talking to a friend in Columbus. I call him, we talk probably twice a month. And I told him we were starting Job. He goes like, "Oh, I hate Job." I was like, "Why? I figured you were a guy, we're very similar personalities. I thought you'd like it." And he goes, "Well, it's just so hard when you get into this discussion to know if what they're saying about God is right or not." And that is part of the challenge. As we get into this discussion, it's just these guys sitting around speculating. And so you're not really sure if what they're saying is to be taken as truth about God or if it's just a representation of human beliefs about that. So we'll wrestle with that in the coming weeks. But I would encourage you, especially from the middle part of Job, don't ever pull a verse out of Job without knowing the context. Because you might be saying something about God that God later says, "No, you guys got it all wrong. That is not how I operate." And so we can't really pull verses out of this and make them, nice memory verses. It's classified as a wisdom book. Can you name the 2 other books commonly classified as wisdom books in the Old Testament? What comes to mind? The first one is obvious. Proverbs, we just finished it, and Ecclesiastes. I saw this thing earlier in the week that Proverbs is for young people, right? It gives you, hey, do these things and things are going to work out for the most part. Honor God in all you do, fear Him and all that. Ecclesiastes is for us middle-agers. There we go. Everything's meaningless. None of this worked out the way I thought it was going to. It's all meaningless. It's all vanity. And yet still we want to honor God. And then Job is like this reflection that takes the 2 and marries them and says, true wisdom is knowing who God is and that you're not going to understand everything. And so it is for later in life. I don't know that young people could even possibly wrestle with Job unless they've had a very difficult life. It is a hard book. It does bring you back to the middle, though. Between Proverbs being almost feels like formulaic. You do this and you'll have a good life. And Ecclesiastes saying, no, it's all meaningless. Job kind of brings us back to the middle. So with all of that said, you ready to jump in? Or should I give you an exit ramp now? Like, okay, I'm out of here. I don't want to go through this. All right, let's jump in. The Job chapter 1, verse 1. I've got the scriptures on the screen. I hope I made it a little smaller so when we get into this poetry, we can get through it all. Let's just get the setting here. Job 1:1. There was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job. And that man was blameless and upright, one who feared God and turned away from evil. There were born to him 7 sons and 3 daughters. He possessed 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, and 500 female donkeys, and very many servants, so that this man was the greatest of all the people of the East. His sons used to go and hold a feast in the house of each one on his day, and they would send an invite to their 3 sisters to eat and drink with them. And when the days of the feast had run their course, Job would send and consecrate them. And he would rise early in the morning and offer burnt offerings according to the number of them all. For Job said, "It may be that my children have sinned and cursed God in their hearts." Thus Job did continually. So we start the book in these first handful of verses just by meeting the main character. Again, we don't know who wrote this, so the book is named after this main character. Man by the name of Job. Uz. Anybody know where that is? Can you guess? We don't know. They're not sure, exactly. Some of your study Bibles, there's plenty of theories. Your study Bible might lean into one of those theories and say this is where it is. But in all honesty, we're not really sure. Northern Arabia is one of them. Down around Edom is, so modern day Syria. We just don't know. We don't know. Plenty of theories, like I said, but we don't know for certain. What we do know from this initial description was he was loaded, was incredibly rich. maybe the richest person at that time. When you start to actually, quantify what it is that he had here, I mean, you look at 7,000 sheep is enormous amount. 3,000 camel, the oxen, 500 pair, which means why would you have oxen other than to go plow fields, right? So imagine if you had to have 500 oxen. I mean, imagine somebody today having 500 tractors, 500 combines. You're going, oh my gosh, he must be just huge amounts of land and operations. Just incredible amounts of money. I for the fun of it, just because I'm silly like that, I just Googled today's value of each of these animals just to see what it would be. And it comes around with the camels being the leading expense, by the way. It comes just around $35 million in today's money. So it was worth far more back then because there are no machines. There are no, this is what you're eating. This is you're plowing fields, not to mention all the employees he had, the servants he had. I mean, we're talking about a major operation here. This is an ancient, Bill Gates or Elon Musk or name your billionaire. That's who Job was. He had so much going on. I think sometimes we think he was just upper middle class. No, he was loaded. He was incredibly rich. Beyond that, he was very blessed in his family. He had 7 sons and 3 daughters who all seemed to get along well and still got together on a regular basis. They'd even rotate who would have each other over for dinner. And then I always thought this part was funny. After all these dinners, Job would take special care to offer sin offerings for them just in case they got a little wild at the party, I guess. He just wanted to cover all his bases. And like I said, he's performing these priestly tasks for his family, probably reminding them to honor God in all they do. And just in case they didn't, offering that burnt offering. We're told there in the very beginning, verse 1, that he was blameless and upright, one who feared God and turned away from evil. This is incredibly important to note when we get into the discussion with all his 3 friends, trying to figure out why the suffering is coming. Yes, we do believe that the New Testament teaches us that all have sinned, but we believe that yes, we have all sinned, but there are some who act in honoring God and glorifying God and wanting to do the best they can. That was Job. Even God himself in a minute is going to point out Job's righteousness. And so the tempting part for us is when his suffering comes about, it's tempting for us to think, well, nobody's perfect, so clearly this is a punishment. What we're going to find out is this is not a punishment for his sins. We see that from these opening verses. He was blameless and upright. Job did nothing to deserve what he's about to get. That's what this means from the outset. Even God himself is going to say that. And so nothing here indicates that he deserves what is about to come upon him. So that's Job. Everybody got a good picture in their mind of who he is? Let's go on to verse 6. Now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them. The Lord said to Satan, "From where have you come?" Satan answered the Lord and said, "From going to and fro on the earth, and from walking up and down on it." And the Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job? That there is none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and turns away from evil." Then Satan answered the Lord and said, "Does Job fear God for no reason? Have you not put a hedge around him and his house and all that he has on every side? You have blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land. But stretch out your hand and touch all that he has, and he'll curse you to your face." The Lord said to Satan, "Behold, all that he has is in your hands now. Only against him do not stretch out your hand." So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord. So, interesting setting here. It seems to be in the heavenly boardroom. There's a meeting going on. God's angels have come back and to report to him some different things. And into that steps this figure that in Hebrew literally is the Satan. It's interesting that literally that's going to mean accuser or adversary. but it's been adopted as a title for the evil one. But I want you to notice that that's not necessarily what Job is saying here. It's something that our translations, does anybody have an article before Satan? And is Satan capitalized every time with a capital S? I think, oh, what do you have? The accuser, yeah. I just was curious as to if anyone actually translates this as the accuser without labeling Satan there. So there's a lot of theories on who this is. Obviously, the leading one is this is Lucifer, the tempter, the evil one, the fallen angel. If that is the case, we're not sure, did this happen before he fell? And he's got this role, and he's kind of like, some scholars pointed out that the accuser, or the adversary, is almost like the district attorney that's bringing a case before the people on earth and saying, God, this is what's happening down there. You need to charge them with that. Others think, no, he's clearly an outsider here, and he's come in from the outside to make these accusations. And so we're going to continue to call him Satan, just as most of our translations do, the accuser, and assume that he is the evil one. But this does add a little bit to his role here, doesn't it? You think of him as just the father of evil and always pushing people to do evil and tempting them. But what he's bringing here is he's basically trying to find evil on the earth and point it out to God so that God can then do something about it. And so that's why in this scenario, God says, have you seen Job? Job's an upright and blameless man. God asks him that, and the accuser responds basically, yeah, but who wouldn't be loyal to you with a life that good? I mean, he's got it made. Why wouldn't you be loyal to you? He's got everything a human being would want. He's been richly blessed. The accuser proposes a test then to see if Job remains faithful. And God grants him this and says, okay, you can, all your stuff, all his stuff is in your hands. Verse 13. Now there was a day when his sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house. And there came a messenger to Job and said, the oxen were plowing and the donkeys feeding beside them. And the Sabeans fell upon them and took them and struck down the servants with the edge of the sword. And I alone have escaped to tell you. So there, if you're keeping track, all of his oxen, all his donkeys, all the things we would consider as farm machinery now are gone, along with all the people that were working those fields, all of them. I mean, you're talking about probably thousands of people here that were working the fields for him are now gone. While he was yet speaking, while that servant was yet speaking, verse 16, there came another. He said, the fire of God fell from heaven and burned up the sheep and all the servants and consumed them, and I alone have escaped to tell you. So there goes the sheep, source of food, source of clothing. All the servants, all the employees that were working those livestock fields were now gone. Verse 17, while he was yet speaking, there came another and said, the Chaldeans formed 3 groups and made a raid on the camels and took them and struck down the servants with the edge of the sword. And I alone have escaped to tell you. So basically, he's got 3 servants left in his entire enterprise. Everything else is gone. Those camels alone were 30 million of it. When I gave you that number, I mean, that was just valuable things, all gone now. All his wealth is gone. His business has come crumbling down. He has nothing monetary left. But you guys know what's coming. It's going to get a lot worse. Verse 18, while that servant was yet speaking, there came another and said, your sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house, and behold, a great wind came across the wilderness and struck the 4 corners of the house, and it fell upon the young people, and they're all dead. I alone have escaped to tell you. Then Job arose and tore his robe and shaved his head and fell on the ground and worshipped. And he said, naked I have come from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. In all this, Job did not sin or charge God with wrong. Horrible story. Horrible story. I mean, first he lost everything that made him a rich man, that made him a wealthy man, but even all of us would say that pales in comparison to he just lost his family. And I think it's important to probably, let's extrapolate just a little. I bet you there was at least a handful of grandkids there. You know, it's not just his sons and daughters. I mean, it was their families that have come together, and I mean, everything now is gone. When we consider ourselves blessed people, we usually talk about material possessions and family. Job has lost everything that made us go, wow, he had a nice life. He was a very blessed man. All of it is gone. All his family, all his wealth are no more. His initial response was what we would expect. Just incredible mourning. He tore his clothes. He probably wailed. He fell to the ground. But then his extended response isn't necessarily what we would expect. It's kind of interesting. He worshiped. He worshiped. After all of that, after witnessing the collapse of his business enterprise that he had built, of all of his family being wiped out by a tornado coming through the house that they all happened to be meeting in, he fell to the ground, and yes, he mourned, but he also worshiped. That word there just simply means bowing down before a superior. It's a recognition of who God still is in the midst of all of this. He recognized God's ability and his right to do such a thing to him and his life. Those words there, we have a song, he gives and takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. That comes from Job. It's a recognition God had the right and the ability to do it. And he glorified God. He had perspective in the midst of this. He said, hey, I came into this world with nothing. I'm going to leave with nothing, apparently. And he had that perspective, and he glorified God even in the midst of this horrible, the worst of circumstances. Some of you in this room have had some bad circumstances. Even in the midst of it, we can worship. It reminds us, I think, a little bit of a takeaway. It reminds us that worship isn't always and doesn't always have to be happy. You know, worship isn't always happy, clappy, and make you feel good. Sometimes worship is lament. And recognizing, you know, some of the best times to worship is maybe even at a funeral, a recognition of perspective of how we come into this world and how we go out of this world and how this world is just temporary. I mean, that is the idea of worship. And so we should be, and we would be right to worship God in the same way that Job has here, to honor him with our loss as much as honoring him with our gain. Any comments on chapter 1 here, or this part of the story? Yeah, Mike. He had to, it's not a coincidence. Yeah, that's true. I'd never thought about that. But when this many things happen to you on one day, you say, okay, this has got to be the Almighty. God is in this somehow. Yeah, Donna. You know we're looking for a church historian, Donna. When we have nothing left but God, God is enough. Yep. Good. Anybody else? Any comments thus far? So it is an interesting story, even so far. The accuser shows up and God says, hey, have you seen Job? Nothing to accuse him. And the accuser says, but wait, he's got a cushy lifestyle. I mean, everything's easy for him. God grants him permission to take all that away, and Job still seems to honor God even in the midst of that. So now it's time for the, Joe.
Don't you wonder why God would just even allow this? He doesn't have to prove anything to Satan.
I think that's one of the things the friends are going to wrestle with. Yeah, why would God allow this? Why even, yeah. Doesn't have to prove anything to Satan. Why does, yeah. So he could write this book, so we could understand suffering. I don't know. No, we do not. So it's time for their next staff meeting or whatever is going on here. The accuser did his worst, and it seems that Job has passed the test. So chapter 2. Again, there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord. And Satan also came among them to present himself before the Lord. And the Lord said to Satan, "From where have you come?" Satan answered the Lord and said, "From going to and fro on the earth, and from walking up and down on it." And the Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job, that there is none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and turns away from evil? He still holds fast to his integrity, although you incited me against him to destroy him without reason." Then Satan answered the Lord and said, "Skin for skin. All that a man has, he'll give for his own life. But stretch out your hand and touch his bone and his flesh, and he will curse you to your face." And the Lord said to Satan, "Behold, he is in your hand, only spare his life." And again, we have that same question, don't we, Joe? Why is God allowing this? And I do think, but that's relevant for us today, right? Why does God allow our suffering? Apparently, he is in control. Why does he allow it? And that's one of the things we have to wrestle with through this book. So far, yes, Job has passed the test, but Satan is noting a caveat here. He said nothing has actually happened directly to him. All we did was take away everything that made him considered blessed. We took away his stuff, we took away his family, but nothing's actually happened to him. He still has his health, and that's what should be tested next. And so God, for some reason, gives him that permission. Verse 7. So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord and struck Job with loathsome sores from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head. And he took a piece of broken pottery with which to scrape himself while he sat in the ashes. Then his wife said to him, "Do you still hold fast to your integrity? Curse God and die." But he said to her, "You speak as one of the foolish women would speak. Shall we receive good from God, and shall we not receive evil?" In all this, Job did not sin with his lips. So Satan attacks Job with something akin to, I guess it would be, anybody ever had I don't know, shingles might be a good description. Incredibly painful. Chicken pox maybe when you were a kid. I remember having the worst case of poison ivy I've ever had. It was actually when they opened Bridgehaven down here, and I was in college at the time, and the church was looking for some volunteers. I just happened to be back, I think, for it must have been spring break. What a way to spend spring break. But I went back and weed whacked knee-high weeds, and apparently it was poison ivy throughout, and it was like solid from where my shorts ended to where my socks began. It was basically one great big sore. And I remember at Ohio State going to the pool every day for 2 weeks trying to dry it out with chlorine. And I can't imagine that from the bottom of my foot all the way to the crown of my head, and just all you wanted to do was just scratch. But as soon as you start scratching this, it opens up and it's painful and something else is scratching. It just sounds awful. And so in the midst of mourning his family and trying to figure out where his and his wife's meal is going to come from, he just sits in the ashes and he just scratches at his sores. A miserable, miserable existence. Awful. His wife looks at all that's happened, can't believe that Job is willing to hold on to his integrity. And this is part of how we define that idea of what it means to have biblical integrity. Integrity means you're the same person regardless of the circumstances. And that's what his wife is challenging him, saying, "Why? Just curse God and die. Why are you holding on to being this good and righteous person? Clearly it doesn't matter. Curse God and die. Be done with all of this." But Job holds on to his integrity. I have an observation here that I'm scared to make, but Satan was trying to make Job's life as miserable as he possibly could, and he left his wife there. That is not a comment on all wives, certainly not a comment on my wife, but it is a comment on Job's wife, right? Like to create misery, he takes away all of his sheep and camels and donkeys and oxen and kids and grandkids and then gives them sores, but he leaves his wife there. I'm just saying. That must say something about the kind of woman she was. Yeah, but now he's got to hear it from her. Uh-huh. That's why he left her. Yeah, Satan says, I'm going to leave her there. She'll do a good job helping me. And so instead of cursing God, Job continues to accept these circumstances as they are from God, considering him good and great and well within his rights to deal with Job however he wanted to. So word gets out about Job's situation. Now, before we get there, any comments on attacking Job personally and Job's reaction? Job continues to do what we would call worship. In all of this, Job did not sin. Again, I think that's important to note. With his lips, it says. We might find out later he's got some stuff going on in his mind, but with his lips, he does not curse God. Any other thoughts?
It's the difference, like today we have problems, we go through trials and that, but a lot of times we look at it, say, God's in charge, he's going to do this, it's going to work out for the best for us. But it seems like Job is at a different level.
Mm-hmm.
It's like a different type of thing, I don't know. I don't think he would look at it like that, well, God's going to bring everything back to you.
No, I think you're right, Joe. I don't think Job is getting through this by saying, you know what, God will restore it all. No, he assumes he's going to die like this. Like he said, naked I came in, naked I go out. I didn't have anything to begin with. And so, yeah, I don't think at any point he thinks, you're right. Sometimes we're tempted to say, well, maybe God will give this back. And no, I don't think Job has that in mind at all. Well, I think to Mike's point, I think he clearly sees that this must be God. The way that this is all unfolded, this must be God. So word gets out in the community about Job's situation, and some of his friends are going to come in and check on him. Verse 11. Now when Job's 3 friends heard of all this evil that had come upon him, they came each from his own place. Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite. They made an appointment together to come to show him sympathy and comfort him. When they saw him from a distance, they did not even recognize him. And they raised their voices and wept. They tore their robes and sprinkled dust on their heads towards heaven. And they sat with him on the ground 7 days and 7 nights, and no one spoke a word to him, for they saw that his suffering was very great. So we meet these guys that we're going to hear from later, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. As far as we know, these were good, genuine friends. There's a couple times where they're going to get in a disagreement in the coming chapters, but I think that's what you do with good friends. There's nothing here to make us suspect that these guys were coming to mock him or anything like that. They genuinely were broken for Job. They couldn't believe that this has happened to him. We're not real sure. Again, I don't know that the places that they're coming from are that important, but I do think that there is something that's being shown here is these are not local Hebrew people that would be in the Israelite family later on. I think what you're seeing here is a representation of the world's wisdom trying to figure out why this happened to Job. I think that's at least their literary purpose here. They're coming to comfort Job, but for us readers, they're representing the world coming to Job, trying to figure out, why does this kind of stuff happen? Why did this happen to you, Job? They got there, it says they made an appointment to come together, which is interesting. That means they probably met somewhere a distance away from Job's place so they could all arrive there, and all 3 of them said, we got to go together. No one of us wants to show up after all this has happened. And so they meet outside of the city or outside of what used to be Job's compound or whatever it was. I can't imagine how much land he had. So they meet outside of that and they come, and it says from a distance, is that Job? It can't be Job. Well, I heard he lost everybody else. I think that's Job. They just could not even recognize him. Don't know if it was the sores, the fact that he had shaved his head, the fact that he was probably almost naked, if not just in sackcloth, just sitting in ashes. And imagine all the other times that they had visited Job. I mean, if you've ever been to a friend's house that was a little wealthier or something, hey, you want to take the jet ski out on my own private lake, or, we want to jump on the yacht together. You weren't used to coming to Job's place and seeing anything like this. So they couldn't even recognize him. They couldn't recognize the situation. They couldn't believe what they saw. And so they come and they just sit with Job, and nobody says anything for a week. Now, I don't know if that's figurative or literal, but if you've ever been with somebody in extreme anguish, sometimes there aren't words. You just kind of come and you just come to sit with them and to mourn with them. I'm sure they cried alongside Job, not as much for the wealth, but for his family, for maybe his grandchildren might have been there, for the situation that he was in, for the physical ailment that he had that probably made him even difficult to look at. They just sat in silence and they continued to mourn what had happened to Job. So yeah, that's an interesting one. I read a couple of different views on that. So what they did was they threw they threw ashes on their head towards heaven. And so that's what they were throwing it maybe up towards heaven and allowing it to land on the top of their head, or they were throwing it up at their face, just doing whatever they could to express their sorrow, to express their mourning. That obviously Job was miserable, and so they're doing what they can to try to match his misery. And so a lot of times you hear this idea of sitting in sackcloth and ashes, and we think of putting it on their head, but that idea of throwing it towards heaven almost made it either they're letting it fall on them or they're throwing it up into their face. Nobody's real sure what that expression means, because we don't mourn like that anymore. They wept with him, yeah. They clearly loved Job. And remember that in the coming weeks. Yeah, that's important to note. Yes. Yep. They really felt very, and think of those ashes now are turning to mud as they're tearing up, and I'm sure nobody's bathing because that's part of this mourning process. Yeah, as a result of the dust. Yeah. So, after a week, Job finally speaks up. Let's read all of chapter 3, what he says. And I want you to think about this. So far, he's been incredible, right? He's had a week now to think about things. And while even in this, he never actually curses God, he does begin to wonder why all this has happened. He's not necessarily as outside as, oh, it's okay, God gives and God takes away. He's starting to say, yeah, why? Why did this occur? If this was indeed my destiny, he says, then I wish I wouldn't have been born in the first place. And that's pretty much what he says in chapter 3. Let me read all of it. After this, Job opened his mouth and he cursed the day of his birth. Job said, let the day perish on which I was born, and the night that said a man is conceived. Let that day be darkness. May God above not seek it, nor light shine upon it. Let gloom and deep darkness claim it. Let clouds dwell upon it. Let the blackness of the day terrify it. That night let thick darkness seize it. Let it not rejoice among the days of the year. Let it not come into the number of the months. Behold, let that night be barren. Let no joyful cry enter it. Let those who curse it curse the day, who are ready to rouse up Leviathan. Let the stars of its dawn be dark. Let it hope for light but have none, nor the eyelids of the morning. Because it did not shut the doors of my mother's womb, nor hide trouble from my eyes. Why did I not die at birth, come out from the womb and expire? Why did the knees receive me, or why the breasts that I should nurse? For then I would have lain down and been quiet. I would have slept. Then I would have been at rest with kings and counselors of the earth who rebuilt ruins for themselves, or with princes who had gold, who filled their houses with silver. Or why was I not as a hidden stillborn child, as infants who never see the light? There the wicked cease from troubling, and there the weary are at rest. There the prisoners are at ease together. They hear not the voice of the taskmaster. The small and the great are there, and the slave is free from his master. Why is light given to him who is in misery, and life to the bitter in soul, who long for death, but it comes not, and dig for it more than for hidden treasures, who rejoice exceedingly and are glad when they find the grave? Why is light given to a man whose way is hidden, whom God has hedged in? For my sighing comes instead of my bread, and my groanings are poured out like water. For the thing that I fear comes upon me, and what I dread befalls me. I am not at ease, nor am I quiet. I have no rest, but trouble comes. Incredibly sad poetry. I mean, really, that is poetry. It's beautifully written. And reading it, I feel like I can relate more to Job after that. to just simply face all that he's faced and said, well, the Lord gives and the Lord takes away. Well, now he's had a little bit of time to wrestle with this, and he says, you know what? I wish that my birthday wasn't on the calendar. That's what he said, verse 7, right? Behold, that night be barren, let no joyful cry enter it. Like when I came in, there was this joyful cry of life. I wish that wouldn't have happened. Let it not rejoice among the days of the year. Let it not come the number of the months. I wish that wouldn't have happened to me. And so Job essentially wishes here that he had never been born. All the great life that he had had for so many years. I mean, think of all that he had had. He'd had a pinnacle of human existence, even in ancient times. I mean, many of us would look at the place he had, the family he had, what he had going, and say, now that's how you need to live. All of it, though, added up for so many years, did not surpass the current pain. He said it wasn't worth it. It wasn't worth it. I feel like I've been set up. I would rather not have had any of that and just been stillborn, never even breathed oxygen. I would have rather had none of it than go through this. And so he does not curse God in this, but now he does curse his own existence. And he begins to wrestle with, why on earth would God do something like this to us? And so we join him in that question as we read through the next 38 chapters. It's going to be him and his friends sitting. Now that Job has spoken up, his friends are going to try to help him figure out why he's happened. Important thing to remember is, you guys said they seem like they're loving friends, right? And so they're genuinely going to be helping him try to figure out why this has happened. And so that's where we'll pick it all up next week in chapter 4 as they begin to wrestle with this. Why has this happened to you, Job? And how can you fix it? You know, how can you maybe get all of this back? What do you need to do? What have you done against God? As we end there, I don't have a slide for it, but I'd ask you guys, any so what's that you'd pull from these first 3 chapters of this very difficult book? Yeah, Joe?
Just the end here, his poem and going through everything. He's saying everything, he's not condemning God, but he's saying everything in the back of his mind. He's saying, why is God doing this?
Yeah.
He's not saying it out loud, but it's there.
And I think, you know, I've sat with grieving parents before, grieving spouses, and I kind of let them know it's okay to be mad at God. You know, in this, don't curse God. You know, don't call him evil. But throughout all of this, I think you see David do that a lot in the Psalms. God, why have you done this to me? Where did you go? You know, why have you left me? Why have you abandoned me? And that it feels like that with Job, doesn't it? He's not cursing God, but he's finally gotten to the point where he's like, this doesn't feel fair. This doesn't feel fair. That yes, I had it made for decades of my life, but I'd trade all of that in to not experience this. This isn't worth it. So yeah, I think some. Let me make an application point of that. I think it's okay for us to be honest with God. I think he can handle it, right? He knows anyway what we're thinking. I do think that's funny, isn't it, that we try to hide our thoughts from God? It's funny. He can handle our pain. He can handle our frustration. Good. That's a good application. Be honest with God.
I think at the time that Andrew was reflecting on all this, since he was afflicted, in verse 27 there, it says, I always feared
Mm-hmm.
this would happen to me, and I dreaded, what I dreaded has come true. So it's like, after he lost everything, he probably was thinking, well, I've lost everything, why hasn't anything happened to me,
Mm.
physically or,
Yeah.
physically, and then wham, it hit. So it's like he always wondered if there was going to be more to it.
Yeah. So what Mike's saying is, in the midst of this is, yeah, I was wondering. Let's talk about how to take verse 25 and 26, or especially verse 25. For the thing I fear comes upon me, and what I dread befalls me. What you're saying is he's anticipating death at this point. It's like, well, I think that's the next domino. What else could happen? That could also possibly mean, though, that in the midst of all these riches, he always wondered if they'd be taken away. Could this happen to me? Or there's another interpretation. As we were reading at that time, I wondered if the thing that was coming upon him, what he dreaded, was his thoughts were getting away from him and he was starting to doubt God. And he's saying, I can feel it coming. It's getting away from me. And now I feel myself questioning. I feel myself wondering. And that I think it could be any one of those three. It could be that he expected death. It could be that all along he expected this to be taken away. Or maybe what he means is now he's tried his best to continue to worship and say, the Lord gives and the Lord takes away. But now after a week of just sitting there and looking around at the absence of stuff, that he finally just broke. And what he feared, his hatred toward. But the Old Testament idea of death, often you'll see called Sheol. And the Jewish version of it wasn't that there was always an afterlife. It would have been just they're at peace. There wouldn't have been another existence. So even most likely what Job is saying here is reflecting that idea. Not that he would go and live with his Creator. He's saying, I'd rather just not exist. I would rather be at peace with those who have gone before me. And Sheol, the grave, is where you don't come back from. That's just the end. And that would have been probably the more ancient belief of there was no afterlife necessarily that they believed in. Because, that's a good point, Gary, because we could say even today, well, if the Lord just takes me, at least I'm in heaven with him, and that'll be better than this. Yeah, we'd all say that. We'd all hope for death in that case. But he's hoping in such a way that probably does not reflect that kind of belief. Right, yeah. Judy? No, it doesn't seem to be, because he could take his own life. I mean, good grief, he's got broken pottery around that he's scraping himself with, or you can probably find something sharp enough to, you'd think at some point. Well, no, it wasn't allowed, right? You can't touch his life, is what he was told. You can only make him as miserable as you possibly can. I think one more application that I came up with was for us to learn to worship regardless of circumstances, and maybe even learn to relish every once in a while being able to worship in the midst of sadness, and what a gift that can be, as weird as that sounds. But it is a different kind of worship when you're worshiping in sadness. Any other thoughts before we close? Yeah, Jenny. Yeah. Couldn't even tempt him to take his own life. Yeah. Yeah. Yep. The demonic. Yeah. So you're making the case that you think this makes a case that suicide is at least primarily a demonic activity, attack. Yeah. Interesting. given us an innate will to live, yeah. Which I would argue Job is lost, but he's not going to take his own life. And so maybe that's either that unconscious will to live, or maybe it's just honoring God that way and doesn't see. I don't know. That's a good point. Or maybe it was that Satan was not allowed to tempt him with that. Maybe that's why his wife was there. Yeah, curse God and die. Yeah. And maybe that is what she was even saying is, why don't you kill yourself? It's not, it might not have been, what she was saying to him might not have been, hey, death is the next domino to fall. He's like, just take matters into your own hands, man. Just end it. Yeah. Well, she's got nothing left to inherit. I mean, there's nothing left in the will. Everything happened to her as well. It's not like she kept her livestock and servants, and yeah, that's true. I mean, it sounds like a week. I mean, the only time gap that we have is between the first heavenly staff meeting and the second heavenly staff meeting, or whatever they were. So if they met weekly, I don't know. That's all speculation. I shouldn't joke. But it could have been 2 days. Well, yeah, all the calamity of the first day happened at once. The only thing that was delayed was each message. It all basically happened at once. The messengers arrived almost simultaneously. And then as far as the sores showing up, it could have been as early as the next day. You're right. Yeah, there's that's a good application point too, is to remember that some of us have had it rough. We've all had negative circumstances, some far worse than others. But there's people in the world that aren't far from Job, that have been through this, that have experienced everything being taken away in a day. Yeah, that's a good point. All right, let's close with prayer, and then next week we'll dive into chapter 4, see how far we make it. Basically, there's 3 cycles of friend discussions. And my intention was to take 1 cycle each week. And so next week, that would be 4 through 14. We'll see if we can even endeavor to do such a thing. Let's pray. God, it's weird to say thank you for this story, because especially if we believe it's historical, Job had to go through it just so we learn a few lessons. None of this seems fair, what happened to him. And I think that is important for us to understand, that it doesn't make sense. Nothing seems fair. We're not going to find a satisfactory human answer to this. And yet, God, may we be challenged to worship you in the midst of all of it. Just like Job did initially, even though he's trying to figure out what's going on and he's being honest and expressing his frustration. God, I pray that we would be able to be honest with you even in the midst of our worship. To be frustrated to you and sing how great is our God. To be able to lose everything and say, it is well with my soul. God, that is the pinnacle of Christian maturity. That we don't love you because of what you've given us, but because of who you are. And so may we pull that from this lesson tonight as we continue to wrestle with this idea of suffering. Give us wisdom and discernment as we read through the rest of this book. It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Have a blessed week. Be careful out there.